Galakasla Nino ga Ninoxola, Nugo Galagamy gaith and Laka Quacosutinuk, Hachwatmis, Muskamok, Zaurinoch. We gachens Hutli Lachlam and Wathlam Quatnala, Laman Wathlingin, Kas Nokai, Enum Localatli, British Columbia. I've acknowledged you all as knowledgeable and respectful people, giving me my traditional name of Galagamy. I'm from what you may know as the Broughton Archipelago, and the words today that I'm going to share are from my heart on behalf of many, many First Nations of British Columbia. Thank you for allowing me the opportunity to present to you today. I open my testimony to you stating that the First Nation Wild Salmon Alliance completely supports the previous FOPO meeting presenters, Andrew Bateman and Brian Riddell of the Pacific Salmon Foundation and Gideon Mordecai of the University of British Columbia. Their combined testimony outlines extremely well the absolute disaster that is the Canadian Science Advisory Secretariat in relationship to the open net pen fish farm industry. CSAS, as a peer review secretariat, has zero credibility with the First Nation members of the First Nation Wild Salmon Alliance. When one examines the CSAS process, this is of course no surprise at all. A so-called science peer review process that allows a proponent, fish farm company, industry, and stakeholders, industry associations, to participate from the beginning to the end of this process is utterly and completely lacking of any measure of objectivity or credibility. Canada's environment, wild fish, and citizens deserve far more from government. CSAS is a shining example of the environment within DFO that needs to be meticulously analyzed and restored back to its original mandate, the mandate of actually working to protect the environment and wild fish for Canadians. You would be hard pressed to find a single First Nation in BC that would state that DFO is doing a good job in managing wild salmon in British Columbia. This is well earned, given that I cannot think of a single wild salmon run in BC that could be characterized as healthy or abundant. It's oft-spoken, the Aboriginal rights that First Nations have recognized in Section 35(1) of Canada's Constitution, and of course the Sparrow decision of Canada's Supreme Court, and the government's commitment to implement the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. These three legal realities speak to food security. It has been said to me that 90% of BC First Nations rely upon wild salmon. 90% of 203 First Nations. This means that wild salmon are far more than a simple menu choice. It is the foundation for culture, traditions, and of course, a staple traditional food that is now becoming near impossible to attain for these purposes. The decision DFO Minister Joyce Murray will be making soon needs to be deeply guided by the legal realities of the Supreme Court of Canada and Canada's constitutional protection of Aboriginal rights. Simply stated, this is a case of rights versus the privilege of a license. DFO has accomplished measures of agreement in BC with some First Nations. I suggest that these will suffer in credibility and function if transitioning open net cage fish farms as committed to by this government and supported by all parties does not occur. A recent poll of British Columbians demonstrates vast support for this transition. I attended a recent DFO Ministers Roundtable for this transition. The framework questions to guide discussions were entirely predictable and offensive and frankly represented a buffalo jump of a predetermined outcome. This opinion was expressed very clearly by all First Nation chiefs whom attended, demonstrating further the need for substantive change within the DFO to remove science from management so a minister can enjoy clear information and recommendations that are unbiased, not to continue having government direction consistently undermined by DFO staff. This was abundantly clear in the recent Maui court decision of DFO Minister Jordan's decision for the Discovery Islands, where the Director of Aquaculture stated, which I paraphrase, that she had no idea that not issuing the fish farm licenses was being considered. This is preposterous, as I know for a fact that Ms. Allison Webb attended many of the First Nation consultation sessions with Discovery Islands First Nations, which I was part of. Not issuing these fish farm licenses was spoken of at every consultation session. Previous FOPO reports and both federal and provincial governments' commitments to UN DRIP call for greater involvement of First Nations in the management of wild salmon in British Columbia. This is also found within the previous DFO Parliamentary Secretary MP Terry Beach's What We Heard report, pertaining to developing and implementing the transition of open net cage fish farms from BC waters. This needs to occur. For today's topic of CSAS and science, First Nations can play a clear and objective role in this effort. One outcome of the Broughton Fish Farm LOU, which I helped negotiate, and of course is the first time Canada witnessed the implementation of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you for all the witnesses for appearing today. It's a very interesting testimony that we've heard throughout this study. And I want to bring us back to how this study motion was worded so that we're focusing on where we really need to get our testimony for the final report. And the study motion was dealing with how DFO prioritizes resources and develops science studies and the advice for the department, and how the results of those scientific studies are communicated to the minister, and how the minister applies that advice in the ministerial decisions. I'll start off with Mr. Chamberlin, if I could. Pardon me if I don't pronounce your traditional name, Galagamy, but very nice to hear that. Mr. Chamberlain, in recent months, we've seen the emergence of coalitions of salmon farmer operators, Indigenous partners, and these coalitions that are arguing that Indigenous partners have the authority to decide whether salmon farms operate in their communities or not. And we're also hearing from some of your testimony today that the effects on wild salmon affect fish or salmon that migrate through their entire migratory routes. In your opinion, how should the Government of Canada approach the scenario where Indigenous rights for different First Nations appear to be at odds?
When we think about First Nations and lands and decision-making and consent as the government pursues this, it would be fine and wonderful if the impacts remain site-specific, but clearly they don't. And so this being the reality and the fact associated with migratory wild salmon, the government is now in a position where they would definitely need to hear First Nations perspectives on consent, but it must also be balanced with what impacts occur, which are infringement of Aboriginal rights across the province. And many times in consultation, many First Nation leaders have heard that the government has made a decision contrary to what's been presented in consultation for the greater good, for the greater benefit of Canadians. Well, that, as sorrowful as it is when it occurs, it must come into play on this discussion, because the impacts of Fraser River salmon writ large, not just sockeye, is occurring where the fish farms are operating in Discovery Islands. And so that is where I think the Crown needs to do, is balance the impacts and the number of nations' rights who are being infringed, rather than the few jobs and the very small number of First Nations that are supportive of this industry. Let's not lose sight of that. That new coalition started out at 17, and then they misrepresented a number of nations, including mine. And I think it dwindled down to a list of 8 or 9 First Nations that are supportive. Thank you.
Good, thank you. You mentioned just moments ago about I believe you stated something along the lines of objective science is not present within DFO, and you mentioned the genome lab that has started in the Okanagan Nation, or the Okanagan Alliance hatchery in Penticton. I've had the opportunity to tour that hatchery and seen some of the success that they're achieving there. Can you elaborate a little further on the lack of objective science, on what you were referring to there?
In my earlier remarks, I highlighted what Mr. J. Parsons' response was to me when I dissected and presented the CSAS process. And when I say lack of objective science, I'm speaking about CSAS in relationship to open net cage fish farms. And when you have a proponent being fish farm company number 1, and then involvement of industry, which is fish farm companies 2, 3, and 4, and then stakeholders being multi industry associations that can be brought in and select people that they're comfortable with to develop a terms of reference, to develop a list of who's going to review the science and develop a paper for peer review, there is no objectivity there. And if we were to pick another industry or another situation like, say, tobacco, this would be utterly unacceptable to Canadians. It would be a very difficult time to pass the red face test. And I think Canadians deserve more, and we need to move to an independent science stream in addition to DFO. And that way we could have shared methodologies, shared sampling, and the outcome will mean someone's going to have to take that tablespoon of Buckley's and someone won't have to.
Thank you. I believe my time is up. I wish I had more time for other panelists, but I believe I'm up.
Mr. Arnold, we'll now go to Mr. Kellaway for 5 minutes or less, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. From Buckley's to me, I'm honored. I, too, want to say that this study has been very illuminating right up until I'm speaking to you. So I thank you for all your insights and your experience and your terms of reference. And I will be sharing my time with MP May. And I want to make sure I have this pronunciation right. Again, it's Galagamy? Is that okay, sir? Thank you.
Well done.
Thank you. Thank you. I had help from MP Baird on that one as well. My quick question is, we heard today Dr. Morton speak of the impact of the closing of Discovery Islands on the salmon stocks as of now in terms of her observations of being healthier. I'm wondering if you could share your assessment, or if you have an assessment, if you could share your assessment, and then we'll transition to your answer and then to Ms. May.
Is that directed to myself? Or?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Yeah. Okay. The comments that I would provide are based upon information that Alexander Morton has shared with me. I also speak with the leadership from my First Nation, the Kwekwasutinu-Chukwamis, the Numgis First Nation, and the Mamalilakla. And they're the ones that are doing these independent science of the Broughton Archipelago. And what I'm learning and hearing from there is not very good in terms of defending the industry. We are learning that the concerns we have are indeed valid. We are learning that the path forward to protect wild salmon and the removal of fish farms is the appropriate path. It's one that, of course, this is it's an occurrence that happens, as Alexander Morton mentioned earlier, about choke points. And certainly Okasolo is one of those places. And there's just the wrong place for a fish farm. I guess in British Columbia, in regards to wild salmon, there is no right place. It's time to meaningfully transition this industry to land-based closed containment. And I can tell you, and I want you all to know, I speak with First Nations from across British Columbia that are very keen and interested in land-based closed containment. And this is the path where we're going.
I just want to take a moment to thank you for all of your work, Bob, in the protection of wild salmon and continued work in around Indigenous rights. and wanted to ask you if you could expand a little bit around the precautionary principle and how it applies to fish farm operations, and what the trickle effect might be from the lack of or the current state of precautionary principles that's in place. Thank you.
Thank you, Lisa Marie, for using my traditional name. Greatly appreciated. In terms of the precautionary principle, during the consultation process for Discovery Islands, that was a big part of the discussions. And we learned that there is no policy pertaining to fish farms in British Columbia to implement the precautionary principle. We were told that they gather what we described as small little tidbits and amass that as some measure of implementation of a precautionary principle. And to me, when you understand, this is unacceptable when you understand the precautionary principle began after the East Coast cod collapse, which we're all well too aware of. And now that we've had 9 science papers categorically dismissed through examination of the CSAS process, the precautionary principle begs for the removal of fish farms from coastal British Columbia.
Thank you. Galagamy, you spoke quite a bit about the importance of salmon, not just for a very nutritious food source, but around the importance of culture and tradition to Indigenous people. And I'm wondering if you can share a little bit around your thoughts on how fish farms may or may not infringe upon Indigenous rights.
Thank you for the question. When you consider that there were no salmon rivers directly adjacent to the fish farms in Discovery Islands, the whole consultation process was about the impacts to migratory salmon. And so when that is the basis, and then when you consider the Supreme Court ruling of the Haida and the Taku Tlingit, even the potential to infringe on Aboriginal rights triggers the duty to consult. So when we know, and DFO acknowledges, that Fraser River salmon, all stocks, not just sockeye, but all stocks, migrate through the Discovery Islands, we must, if we're in all good conscience to live up to a Supreme Court law and the Constitution of this country, the minister must understand that the infringement of Aboriginal rights from fish farm operations extends far beyond site-specific. And it does trigger the duty to consult, which I have never seen DFO even want to contemplate. And I believe it's because the vast majority of British Columbia First Nations we've identified 102 that support the transition of fish farms out of the ocean. And so the DFO minister and the Canadian government must understand the infringement of rights from the operation of open net cage fish farms extends across British Columbia.
Thank you, Galagamy. I want to direct my last question to you as well to make sure we're able to soak in as much time as possible before you leave early. You had mentioned an encouraging step for Indigenous-led science, specifically speaking to the Genomics project in the Okanagan. And I'm wondering if you can speak a little bit further about this project, how it was developed, and why this is so encouraging for you.
Thank you. The Broughton Archipelago Fish Farm LOU with the province of British Columbia was shared recommendations and shared decision-making implementing the United Nations Declaration on Rights of Indigenous People, which of course the federal government has committed to do as well. One of the outcomes was the Genome Lab, because DFO created as many hurdles and speed bumps for us to do the testing that was agreed upon in the agreement through the Genome Lab in Nanaimo at the Pacific Biological Station. So we said, let's put together a proposal and build a Genome Lab that doesn't have those kinds of impediments to the outcomes of the chosen science that we wanted to pursue. And as a result of that, the Genome Lab is built in the Okanagan Nation Alliance hatchery. It has been, as far as I understand, this past year has been about training and capacity, because it's far more complicated than just putting a sample in and pushing the green button. So we're at a place now where this is going to be ready to be functional. And in terms of objective science, which clearly is not present within CSAS and the DFO, and the stated path of federal and provincial governments to work with First Nations on wild salmon, this is an opportunity that the government must embrace, a clear opportunity to advance many of the commitments, but most importantly, objective science that can then guide decision-making. And in terms of the question that was given to Alexander Morton, who our family know as Gwayumzi, the question about a manager of wild salmon, we need one, we need a First Nation role there because of our constitutionally protected rights, because of the special place that we have in this country. And it would be something that would be fundamental to reconciliation, foundational across British Columbia.
And my question may be a little bit vague, but it's really going back to your point about the fundamental role of First Nations in reconciliation and in being at the table in decisions about salmon. And my question, I guess, is about governance and what the relationship between governance of BC First Nations and the role that you play or should play. I mean, is it a matter of goodwill? Is it a matter of governments? Are there fundamental changes in the relationship between First Nation and provincial and federal partners that need to take place?
Thank you for your question. When I consider the provincial and federal governments have both made commitments to fulfill reconciliation, to implement the UN Declaration on Rights of Indigenous People, this to me is that evolution. We must not wait for the great big silver horse to come riding in with reconciliation in tow. We must find opportunities that present themselves to begin to implement meaningfully what that co-governance and shared decision-making can look like. And I think when we do this, when opportunities arise, we are going to be able to demonstrate to Canadians that there is nothing to fear about First Nations being in a consent-based shared decision-making model, and that we can, and by and large, have fought to protect the environment, to have stronger environmental considerations in a wide range of different industries. And I believe that the global community is now crying out and demanding greater environmental protection. So I think in terms of salmon, this is an opportunity where if the government of Canada and the province was to implement by creating some measure of First Nation role within their system to engage with First Nations, someone that has the respect and knowledge, would be able to facilitate the discussion. Because when you're talking about 203 First Nations, you're talking about a lot of leaderships, a lot of different local concerns, but the global concern can be incorporated within the federal and provincial governments in some measure of First Nation advisory role.